Roy Neary was an ordinary man trapped in an ordinary life, until one day he witnesses the extraordinary, a visitor from beyond the stars. This singular event turns his life upside down as he loses his job and his family to a growing obsession to understand the visions planted in his mind by the alien beings, visions that lead him and many others to a profound meeting between extraterrestrials and humanity. Despite the best efforts of shadowy government forces to keep it all a secret, Roy risks his life, his freedom, and his sanity to reach Devil's Tower, Wyoming, the appointed location where worlds are scheduled to collide. Before we begin, please take a moment to hit that like button, and if you do like what I'm doing, don't forget to subscribe for more content. The omnipotent and unforgiving YouTube algorithm demands a pittance, and I could really use the support. Thank you in advance. With that out of the way, let's get back to the subject at hand. In 1964, a 17-year-old high school kid named Steven Spielberg produced a feature film with the help of his friends, family, and the high school band. Made for $500, Spielberg showed the film at a local cinema and charged $1 a ticket, earning $501 in gross, making Firelight the first in a long line of profitable motion pictures for the young man. Firelight was the story of alien abductions in a small town as investigated by a group of scientists, and it featured a B-plot about a failing marriage. Though the majority of the film has been lost, what little remains demonstrates many of the hallmarks of Spielberg's subsequent career in filmmaking, albeit in a primordial, ultra-low-budget form. After making his Hollywood debut a few years later with 1971's Duel, Spielberg kept going back to the ideas he explored in Firelight. He was, well into his 30s, a believer on the subject of aliens and UFOs, convinced they had visited the Earth. With that in mind, he sought to develop a big-budget, updated version of Firelight. Conceiving of it as a UFO movie and Watergate-inspired thriller smushed together, his earliest drafts of the new project were titled Watch the Skies, taken from the famous closing lines of 1951's The Thing from Another World, and then renamed Kingdom Come. Studios weren't fond of science fiction in the early 70s, treating the genre as all but dead outside of a niche, unprofitable audience, but while Spielberg was doing post-production on 1973's The Sugarland Express, he managed to work out a deal with Columbia Pictures for a sci-fi film that would cost no more than $2.7 million. Spielberg knew it wouldn't be possible to film what he wanted with the agreed-upon budget, but as a man still in his early 20s with only a handful of films under his belt, he lacked the clout to be given anything higher. Not happy with the screenplays he'd commissioned, Spielberg began work on something else first. While filming the killer shark movie Jaws, Kingdom Come was never far from his mind, and he talked about it at length with his friend Richard Dreyfuss, who was also starring in Jaws. Dreyfuss, enthusiastic about the concept, worked tirelessly to convince a skeptical Spielberg that he was the man to take the lead role, a character who had originally been a CIA agent or police officer, but who was now, in more recent drafts, something of an immature everyman. Spielberg eventually decided to pen his UFO project himself, and so Close Encounters of the Third Kind was born. For inspiration, Spielberg turned to the work of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, a civilian who had worked on Project Blue Book as a UFO debunker before becoming convinced that at least some of the reports he had been reviewing had to be genuine. It was Hynek who coined the term Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which refers to a classification system he developed. The first kind of encounter is when aliens are visually sighted, the second kind is when they leave behind physical evidence, and the third kind is when communication takes place. Hynek became Spielberg's advisor on set, and even makes a cameo in the film's climax. Very early in pre-production, Spielberg worked with composer John Williams on the critical musical conversation that takes place in the film's final act. Finding the 5-note trigger that has since become famous was no easy task, and the entire climactic musical sequence had to be written, performed, and recorded long before it was ever put to film. Before Close Encounters of the Third Kind was finally able to be made, though, Spielberg had to finish his shark movie. Jaws turned out to be one of the biggest box office hits of all time, launching Spielberg into superstardom. With his increased profile and celebrity, he was able to gradually massage more money out of Columbia Pictures, even though the studio was heading for a financial cliff. By 1977, the budget had reached an estimated $20 million, which Columbia afforded through loans and other desperate measures. Many actors were considered for the lead role of Roy, both by Spielberg and by Columbia Pictures. The list included Steve McQueen, who turned Spielberg down personally at a bar, Jack Nicholson, who didn't think it was possible to act around invisible visual effects, Al Pacino, who declined without comment, Gene Hackman, who was going through marital difficulties and was unwilling to leave LA for the extended periods required, and James Caan, who asked for far too much money. Eventually, Spielberg gave in to the constant prodding of Dreyfuss, who continued to lobby heavily for the part, and agreed he was the best choice. In addition to Dreyfuss, Spielberg hired Terry Garr to play Roy's wife Ronnie. Even though Garr was a well-known comedic actress, she got the part because Spielberg saw her in a coffee commercial. Next, for the interpreter David, came Bob Balaban, who may have overstated how well he spoke French in order to get the job, and Melinda Dillon as Gillian, the mother whose son is kidnapped and who shares a bond with Roy over the course of the film. For the French scientist Claude Lacombe, a character loosely based on the real-life French ufologist Jacques Vallée, Spielberg's first choice was the acclaimed French director François Truffaut. When looking to cast the role, Spielberg didn't initially think to ask Truffaut, assuming the man was simply too important and too well respected to act in a big-budget alien movie, instead auditioning actors like Gerard Depardieu and Lino Ventura. Unsatisfied with these options, Spielberg did eventually ask Truffaut, who agreed on condition that Spielberg not ask him to act like anybody but himself. There are a few notable bit parts, like Lance Henriksen, Carl Weathers, and Richard Dreyfuss's own nephew, Justin Dreyfuss, who plays Roy's son, Toby. But the breakout performance was done by 3-year-old Cary Guffey, a little boy with no acting experience who got along so well with Spielberg and the crew that he was a natural fit. Spielberg used a multitude of tricks to get the best performance out of him, such as showing him cool toys to get him excited, hiding his real-life mother behind a doggy door to convince him to crawl through it, and most famously surprising him with a gorilla mask and a clown. Spielberg's greatest trick, though, was simply explaining things to Guffey in detail, to the point that he was never afraid, even during the most harrowing scenes where Melinda Dillon, playing his mother, was fearing for their mutual safety. Probably the most heartbreaking moment appears near the end of the film, when Guffey says goodbye to the aliens. In preparation for this scene, Spielberg told Guffey to act as though his real-life friends were going away, which the 3-year-old interpreted as meaning forever. And so Guffey immediately began crying once the camera started rolling, which caused Dillon to cry and try to comfort him. I also have to note that this guy, Philip Dodds, who plays the character Jean-Claude, was first hired as a sound technician whose job was to set up the synthesizer. Spielberg saw him work on it and play it a few times on set, and from that alone, he decided he was perfect for the role. The overall shoot was ambitious, with location shooting in India, Wyoming, and Alabama. The biggest set, the UFO landing site used in the film's climax, was built inside one of 2 abandoned dirigible hangars at Brickley Air Force Base. And at over 280,000 cubic feet, it holds the record for the largest interior space ever used in a motion picture, at least according to the filmmakers. The visual effects on this film were unprecedented too, involving digital motion control compositing rigs that were state-of-the-art. At one point, Spielberg entertained the idea of computer-generated effects, but it would be over a decade before the technology caught up with Spielberg's ambition, and so he decided to go in a more practical direction. He didn't know exactly how he was going to pull it all off when the film was in principal photography, and as a result, the actors on screen are almost always reacting to things that hadn't yet been conceived of, much less created. This kind of filmmaking, while commonplace now, was considered borderline insane in the 70s. Spielberg brought on several special effects wizards to help, including Douglas Trumbull, who was the only American to work on the effects for Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Trumbull had done many big films and had recently finished work on Silent Running, which he also directed, and so he got the job of visual effects supervisor. Most of the models were built by Gregory Jean, who would later go on to have a very successful run of work on the Star Trek films and Star Trek The Next Generation, and it was his job to build the showstopper of the film, the enormous alien mothership. Spielberg imagined the ship based on a lit-up oil refinery he saw while filming in India, describing his vision as a floating city standing on an inverted, rounded cityscape. And legendary designer Ralph McQuarrie, most famous now for his work on Star Wars, drew up a few sketches that wound up being remarkably close to what you see in the final film. As a play on the idea of a mothership, the rounded end is also meant to subliminally evoke a breast, the landing platform that emerges from it acting as a nipple. Famously, when building the mothership out of spare model parts and other bits of miscellaneous junk, Gene and his crew tossed in a few Easter eggs that were never meant to be seen in the final film, including a Volkswagen bus, a mailbox, a small cemetery, and more. You can see them for yourself today at the Smithsonian's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia, where the model is on display. One of the Easter eggs that actually does sneak its way into the film is this one here, which if you look carefully you can tell is an inverted R2-D2. Spielberg was good friends with Star Wars' creator George Lucas, and in the late 70s they had a bet going as to which of their upcoming science fiction films would do better at the box office. Lucas was convinced that his sci-fi fantasy flick would not do well, and that Spielberg was too much of a genius to fail with his UFO movie, whereas Spielberg had a sense that Lucas's film, Star Wars, would surpass his own movie and become a phenomenon of its own. Spoiler alert, Spielberg won the bet. Spielberg aimed for a summer 1978 release date, but the studio, looking at imminent bankruptcy, forced him to complete the film for Christmas 1977. Spielberg and editor Michael Kahn had to cut together the picture in record time in a rented apartment. The apartment, like the entire production, was under heavy secrecy and security, as both Columbia and Spielberg were paranoid that another studio would rip off the ideas of the film and rush something into production to compete with it. Though the director was unhappy with the final product and wished he could have had a few more months to finish it, Close Encounters of the Third Kind opened in November and December of 1977 to critical praise and record-breaking box office receipts. It made a domestic gross of $116 million, with another $171 in international markets, for a total of $288 million worldwide. It was Columbia Pictures' most successful film to date at that time, more than recouping the enormous financial gamble and giving the studio enough money to save itself from oblivion. Naturally, they wanted a sequel, and Spielberg did toy with the idea for a couple of years. There was a working concept called Night Skies that had more horror elements thrown in, but that eventually morphed into a standalone script for a family-oriented film about an alien left behind that would come to be known as E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Columbia wasn't interested in that idea, though, and E.T. went to Universal Studios. Instead of a sequel, then, Spielberg asked Columbia if he could finish what he had started, if he could have $1 million or so to film some additional scenes and do some additional editing to get Close Encounters of the Third Kind closer to his original vision. Columbia agreed if, and only if, a scene was added from within the mothership, which would be a great hook on which to hang a marketing strategy. Thus was born the Special Edition, which was released in late 1980 and earned another $15.7 million. For the next 17 years, the Special Edition became the only version widely available on home video. In 1997, though, in honor of the film's 30th anniversary, Spielberg would again have the chance to tinker with the film and put out a director's cut, which combined the best of both cuts and removed the mothership interior, which he felt should never have been filmed. Close Encounters of the Third Kind has always been a weird movie for me. Spielberg's intent was to create something uplifting that cut through adult skepticism to reveal a universe of childlike wonder, and though he does succeed at that, the film isn't as heartwarming as he wanted it to be. The most problematic thing is the ending, in which Roy happily leaves his wife and kids behind. Spielberg admits he wouldn't have ended the film this way after he had children of his own, and it gives the whole story a disturbing thematic angle where normal American life and the nuclear family are portrayed as banal and miserable things to be transcended. Though Spielberg's youth was marked by a relatively stable home, his parents did divorce when he was 19, and it traumatized him as surely as if he were much younger. As a result, his view of children and marriage was pretty skewed when he was in his 20s. The main theme of the movie is one of communication, with the film focusing on the different ways we communicate and the barriers between them. There are linguistic barriers demonstrated by Lacombe needing a translator, the hand signals to help the deaf understand music, which was a system invented by the Reverend John Kerwin and popularized by famed educator Zoltan Kodály, the way the aliens communicate through music, and the inability of Roy and Bonnie to effectively communicate what's happening to their family as a result of Roy's experiences and deteriorating mental state. On that note, I can empathize with an overworked housewife with multiple children and a man-child of a husband, but I have a hard time understanding why Bonnie doesn't try harder to get Roy the professional help he needs, especially in the special edition and director's cut versions of the film, in which Roy is seen literally begging her for help. Instead, she just straight up abandons him, and that feels even more unforgivable to me than Roy getting on a spaceship. Granted, he does kiss another woman first, which is also not cool. The biggest problem I have with the film, though, is the odd way in which information is delivered. Not much is really known for certain, with almost every detail left open to interpretation and assumption. Ambiguity is fine as far as it goes, but this feels like a movie that is trying to get across a very specific point of view about aliens and UFOs that is undone by its own unwillingness to commit to anything specific. It's never even clearly stated who certain characters are or who they work for, nor is it clear what the aliens want or why they do any of the things they do in the film. On a rational level, then, I don't think Close Encounters of the Third Kind really works. It hasn't aged particularly well either. The UFO/alien abduction craze was big for many years, popularized in large part by this movie, but it has seen diminishing returns in the 21st century, relegated to the bizarre late-night ramblings of the History Channel, or to Flat Earther-style discussion threads on Reddit. Even Spielberg admits he's not much of a believer anymore. On an emotional level, though, Close Encounters of the Third Kind is still a special film that deserves credit for going places and doing things nobody but a young Steven Spielberg could. Before Spielberg came along, UFOs and aliens in film were almost always portrayed as menacing or frightening. Even Klaatu and Gort are threatening to destroy mankind. And Spielberg almost single-handedly managed to turn that around. What resonates the most for me is the idea that children, in their innocence, find beauty and wonder in things that adults can find awful or terrifying, that children happily open doors to the unknown, whereas adults slam them shut and bolt the locks. Of course, with this film, Spielberg also deserves credit for helping prove the major Hollywood studios wrong about the state of science fiction cinema. Films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Alien, and of course Star Wars, sparked an enormous revival in science fiction that persisted throughout the 80s and into the 90s. More importantly, though, it proved that Spielberg's Jaws was more than just a fluke, that Steven Spielberg was a director who could go on to become one of the biggest and most influential people in Hollywood history. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. If you haven't done so already, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. To support what I do even more, check out my Patreon, where you can vote on future videos, get early access to whatever I'm working on next, and much more. For written reviews of several science fiction classics in both film and literature, you can also head over to my website at emcgill.com. Until next time, this is The Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anyone.